On the quiet, picture-perfect street of Maple Lane, every house looked almost identical. White fences framed manicured lawns, pastel shutters framed spotless windows, and not a single mailbox stood out from another. The Homeowners Association took pride in that perfection, a kind of uniform beauty that left no room for individuality. To most people, it was the ideal suburban dream, but to one man, it was the most lifeless canvas he had ever seen. Ethan Wells had moved into Maple Lane hoping for peace. After years of living in the city, surrounded by noise and chaos, he wanted somewhere calm to paint, to create, and to find inspiration. A small cul-de-sac with friendly neighbors and tidy yards seemed perfect. He bought a modest two-story house at the end of the street, one with a wide porch, a little garden, and a big open wall that caught the sunlight in the mornings. He saw potential where others saw conformity. The day Ethan moved in, the neighbors smiled politely, offering waves from across the street, but little more. They were polite, yes, but distant. The kind of people who would bake cookies for the HOA meeting, but never for a new resident. Still, Ethan didn't mind. He had his paints, his brushes, and his imagination. What more could he need? A month later, after unpacking and settling in, Ethan finally began his biggest project yet, repainting the outside of his home. It had been faded beige when he bought it, the same shade as every other house on the block. He wanted something brighter, something that reflected how he saw the world. So one morning, he stood before his house with a color palette that could only be described as daring. Ocean blue for the walls, sunshine yellow for the trim, and a deep coral red door that seemed to glow at sunset. It wasn't just a home, it was art. By the time the project was halfway done, Ethan felt more alive than he had in years. Neighbors slowed their cars as they passed, some smiling, others frowning. He heard whispers from the next yard, caught the flicker of blinds as people peeked through their windows. He could feel the curiosity spreading like wildfire. The new guy on Maple Lane was turning his beige house into a masterpiece of color, but curiosity soon turned to disapproval. The HOA president, Mrs. Caldwell, a retired real estate agent with an obsession for uniformity, noticed the change almost immediately. She was known for patrolling the neighborhood in her golf cart, clipboard in hand, always on the lookout for violations. When she saw Ethan's half-painted home, she reportedly gasped loud enough for the gardeners across the street to hear. Within a day, she had sent him a letter. It was brief, cold, and to the point. Your current exterior color scheme violates community guidelines. Please restore your home to an approved neutral shade within 14 days to avoid penalties. Ethan read the letter 3 times, each time feeling a strange mix of disbelief and amusement. He had paid for the house, paid his dues, and followed every rule, except one that no one had ever explained to him. There had been no mention of approved colors in the stack of HOA documents he'd signed. At least, not that he remembered. Still, he thought perhaps it was just a misunderstanding. He would talk to them, explain that it was just paint, nothing harmful. Surely they would understand. But when he attended the next HOA meeting, he quickly realized understanding was not part of their agenda. The board sat at the front of the clubhouse, stern and united. They looked at him like he had committed a crime. Mrs. Caldwell spoke for them all, insisting that the neighborhood had aesthetic standards to maintain. Ethan's home, she said, disrupted visual harmony. Her words were met with murmurs of agreement from others. The idea that a splash of color could be so offensive both amused and infuriated Ethan. He tried to reason with them, mentioning that his home was simply painted in cheerful colors. Not neon, not tacky, just bright and positive. But the board had already made up its mind. They gave him one final warning, and a fine if he failed to comply. That night, Ethan sat on his porch, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. Every house looked the same. Beige, tan, off-white, a sea of dullness. He thought about what Mrs. Caldwell had said. Visual harmony. But to him, harmony wasn't sameness. Harmony was balance, a blend of different tones that worked together. The street didn't have harmony. It had control. The next morning, he made a decision that would change Maple Lane forever. He walked to his garage, pulled out every can of paint he owned, and lined them up on the driveway. Reds, blues, greens, purples, golds. Shades that danced under the sunlight. If the HOA thought his blue and yellow house was too colorful, they hadn't seen anything yet. He wasn't just going to repaint. He was going to create something unforgettable. By the end of that day, he had begun transforming his house into something entirely new. Every wall became a section of a larger vision, swirling gradients, radiant patterns, and colors that seemed to shift with the light. Passers-by slowed down even more now, not in disapproval but in fascination. Some even stopped to take pictures. The HOA hadn't sent another letter yet, but Ethan knew it was coming. He didn't care. Because this time, it wouldn't just be paint on a wall. It would be a statement. A few neighbors whispered that he was asking for trouble. Others quietly cheered him on, though never publicly. The street began to buzz with talk. The rebel artist versus the iron-fisted HOA. And as Ethan stood on the roof one evening, painting the final strokes of a massive rainbow across the front facade, the sun set behind him, flooding the street with color. In that moment, Maple Lane didn't look uniform anymore. It looked alive. But for every person who admired the beauty, there was another preparing to complain. Because for the HOA, and especially for Mrs. Caldwell, this was war. Morning came quietly to Maple Lane. The soft hum of sprinklers filled the air, and the sound of distant lawnmowers blended with the chirping of birds. Everything seemed ordinary, except for one thing. Ethan's rainbow-painted home now stood in full, unapologetic color, blazing like a beacon in a sea of beige. It didn't take long for the first complaints to start. Mrs. Caldwell, the HOA president, was already outside before sunrise, her golf cart parked directly across from Ethan's driveway. She sat stiffly, clipboard in hand, her lips pressed into a thin line. From behind her oversized sunglasses, she surveyed the house like a general studying an enemy fortress. By mid-morning, a small group of curious neighbors had gathered near the sidewalk, whispering in disbelief. Some were entertained, others horrified. One woman muttered that the house looked like a circus tent. Another admitted, almost reluctantly, that it was kind of beautiful. But none of that mattered to Mrs. Caldwell. To her, it was a direct violation, an attack on everything she believed the neighborhood stood for. Within hours, the first letter arrived. This one wasn't polite. It was stern, packed with legal jargon and citations from the HOA bylaws. It declared that Ethan's home violated Section 8.4, subparagraph B, defiance, a rule about maintaining uniform and approved color palettes within the community. It ordered him to restore the property to an approved neutral tone within 7 days or face escalating fines, property lines, and possible legal action. The letter was hand-delivered. Mrs. Caldwell herself had the satisfaction of placing it directly in Ethan's mailbox before retreating down the driveway with a smug expression. But Ethan didn't flinch. He had expected this. In fact, he had prepared for it. He took a deep breath and returned to painting, adding details, subtle outlines of flowers, sweeping strokes of cloud patterns, and shimmering metallic highlights that caught the light. Every brushstroke felt like defiance, but it also felt like truth. For him, art was freedom, and no committee could regulate that. As the days passed, Maple Lane transformed from a quiet street into something of a spectacle. Cars began to slow down as they passed his home. Strangers stopped to take photos. Some even got out of their cars to admire the details up close. It wasn't long before the images hit social media, first local, then regional. The post titles were as colorful as the house itself. Artist defies HOA rules with stunning rainbow home. Neighborhood war over, paint job goes viral. HOA nightmare or neighborhood landmark. The comments poured in. Thousands of people weighed in online. Some called him brave, others called him reckless, but everyone had an opinion. Meanwhile, Mrs. Caldwell was losing control. Her phone rang non-stop. Angry calls from board members, panicked emails from residents who worried their property values would drop, and questions from local reporters seeking statements. She tried to maintain her composure, but each day seemed to chip away at her authority. At the next HOA board meeting, the atmosphere was electric. What was usually a dull hour of budget reports and landscaping discussions became a shouting match about Ethan's house. Half the members demanded immediate legal action. The other half hesitated, afraid of public backlash. One man even admitted that his teenage daughter thought the house was cool and had posted it on TikTok, where it was blowing up. Still, Mrs. Caldwell wouldn't back down. She framed it as a battle for community integrity. She insisted that if they let Ethan get away with this, the neighborhood would descend into chaos. Pink houses, blue lawns, mismatched fences. "We must preserve order," she said. "We can't let one man destroy what we've built." The board voted unanimously to fine Ethan $500 a day until he repainted. When the notice arrived, Ethan simply smiled. He pinned it to his studio wall, a reminder of why he had started this. He wasn't just painting a house. He was exposing how fragile their version of order really was. But things quickly escalated. Within a week, Mrs. Caldwell began sending inspectors, men with clipboards who took photos from the street, measured fence heights, and checked for secondary violations. One even claimed Ethan's garden gnome did not comply with approved yard decor standards. It was harassment, thinly veiled as enforcement. Neighbors started picking sides. Some avoided eye contact when they saw him, afraid of being associated with the troublemaker. But others began quietly supporting him. They dropped off coffee, small notes of encouragement, and even offered to help with supplies. One family down the street repainted their mailbox in rainbow stripes, subtle but symbolic. The more the HOA pushed, the more people began to question their authority. Ethan's story continued to spread online. Local reporters showed up one afternoon, eager to film his battle against the HOA. He stood on his lawn, camera crews rolling, and simply explained that he believed every homeowner should have the right to express themselves. That beauty shouldn't be dictated by a rule book. The footage aired that night, and by morning, his house had become a local landmark. People drove from nearby towns to see the Rainbow House. Kids laughed as their parents took selfies out front. It became a symbol of art, rebellion, and freedom. For Mrs. Caldwell, it was a nightmare. She doubled down, sending threats of legal action and scheduling emergency HOA meetings. But her tone had changed. There was desperation now. A sense that she was losing control not just of Ethan, but of the entire neighborhood. Behind the scenes, other board members began to question her leadership. Was it really worth dragging the HOA into a public feud that was making them look heartless? Still, Caldwell refused to yield. She filed a formal complaint with the county zoning department, hoping local authorities would intervene. She even hired a lawyer. And as Ethan continued painting, he noticed something strange. Cars parked across the street for hours, people taking photos but never approaching. Some had cameras with long lenses. Others wore badges. The HOA wasn't just sending letters anymore. They were building a case. It was no longer a neighborhood dispute. It was a full-blown standoff. But Ethan wasn't afraid. If anything, he was inspired. Every new threat only pushed him to create more. He began working late into the night, adding murals along his fence. Butterflies, clouds, rainbows, and words of positivity hidden in the designs. His house had become a message, freedom through color, and that message was spreading far beyond Maple Lane. One morning, Ethan woke to find dozens of people standing outside his gate. News crews, journalists, and curious onlookers. Someone had shared his story nationwide, and now, his quiet street had turned into a tourist stop. The HOA's worst fear had come true, but the real storm was still coming, because Mrs. Caldwell was about to take the fight to the next level. The neighborhood that once prided itself on silence now buzzed with noise and attention. Cars lined the curb every morning, people taking photos or recording videos. The once private cul-de-sac of Maple Lane had become a public attraction. For Ethan, the attention was strange but not unwelcome. He never set out to be famous, only to be free. But the HOA saw it differently. To them it was humiliation on display. Mrs. Caldwell's patience had evaporated. The Rainbow House was now on every local news segment, and the story was spreading online faster than she could contain it. Words like HOA tyranny and artistic rebellion filled the comment sections under each post. The more she tried to control the narrative, the worse it got. In her mind, Ethan had made a mockery of the association, and that could not be tolerated. She called an emergency board meeting, gathering the most loyal members of the HOA in the small beige-painted clubhouse that matched their version of perfection. Inside, the mood was tense. Documents were spread across the long oak table, printouts of the viral posts, photos of Ethan's house, copies of community bylaws, and letters drafted by their lawyer. Mrs. Caldwell spoke with the determination of a commander preparing for battle. The HOA, she said, would sue. They would demand immediate compliance, restitution for damaging the community's reputation, and recovery of all legal fees. She claimed Ethan's actions had devalued property and caused emotional distress to neighbors who no longer felt pride in their street. It was a ridiculous argument, but the board voted in favor. The lawsuit was filed within days. Ethan received the thick envelope on a windy afternoon. It was formal, stamped, and heavy with threat. The HOA demanded that he repaint his house within 5 days and pay a series of fines that now exceeded several $1,000s. Failure to do so, the letter warned, would lead to property liens and court action. He stood on his porch, reading the document slowly, feeling the weight of what was happening. He had expected resistance, but not this level of aggression. Still, he wasn't afraid. He spent that evening gathering his own paperwork, receipts, photographs, and, most importantly, the original HOA guidelines. Buried within the fine print, in a section most residents never read, was a single clause. All external color modifications must be pre-approved if listed within the HOA's restricted color palette. But the palette itself, he noticed, hadn't been updated or attached since the 1990s. It was a loophole, and possibly his way out. Meanwhile, the story continued to explode online. National news outlets picked it up, interviewing neighbors, realtors, and even HOA experts. Ethan's Rainbow House became a symbol of resistance against overreaching neighborhood associations. The comments were overwhelmingly in his favor. People mailed him letters of support, sent donations for his legal fees, and even offered to organize fundraisers. For every rule the HOA cited, the internet responded with outrage. But Mrs. Caldwell refused to bend. She hired a private attorney, a sharp, meticulous man known for intimidating opposition into submission. He sent Ethan an official demand letter threatening further legal action if he didn't comply immediately. The HOA also began sending violation notices to residents who supported Ethan, accusing them of unrelated infractions: unapproved flower beds, visible trash bins, minor fence repairs. The neighborhood was splitting in two. On one side stood Mrs. Caldwell and her loyal rule keepers, people terrified of change, clinging to order. On the other stood those inspired by Ethan, homeowners tired of being controlled by fear and paperwork. Ethan knew he couldn't let the HOA win through intimidation, so he hired his own lawyer, a local attorney who had once gone viral herself for taking on a similar HOA case years prior. Together they built a defense rooted in simple logic. The HOA had no legal standing to enforce an outdated, undefined rule. The supposed restricted color palette was non-existent, and without it, the HOA's claim fell apart. The first hearing was set for early summer. On the day of the court session, Maple Lane felt like a scene out of a movie. Reporters lined the sidewalks, cameras flashing as Ethan and his attorney walked toward the courthouse. Mrs. Caldwell arrived separately, flanked by her lawyer and a few board members, all of them dressed in beige and gray, as though to visually emphasize their message of neutrality. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The HOA's lawyer spoke first, arguing that Ethan had violated the community's sense of unity and lowered property values through his unapproved alterations. He showed photos of the Rainbow House, printed in dull grayscale images to make it look chaotic and unpleasant. He referenced bylaws and claimed Ethan's actions were reckless and disrespectful. Then it was Ethan's turn. His attorney presented the HOA documents, highlighting the missing color palette and ambiguous language. She pointed out that the rules, as written, were unenforceable without proper procedure. More importantly, she argued that the HOA was selectively enforcing its rules to target one resident, a clear act of harassment and discrimination. The judge listened carefully. At one point, he asked Mrs. Caldwell directly if she could produce the official list of approved colors. She couldn't. The silence in the room was deafening. By the end of the hearing, it was clear where things were headed. The judge ordered both parties to return with additional documentation within 2 weeks. But his tone suggested skepticism toward the HOA's claims. That night, Mrs. Caldwell was furious. Her once iron grip on Maple Lane was slipping, and she knew it. She doubled down again, ordering a campaign of community pressure. She sent out flyers urging residents to protect property values and stand against defiance. Some neighbors complied, hanging beige ribbons on their mailboxes as a silent protest. But others fought back, painting small rainbow stripes across their curbs, planters or porch steps. Ethan's stand had started something bigger. What began as one man's artistic rebellion had become a movement, a quiet uprising against conformity. Over the next week, Ethan continued painting not just for himself, but for everyone who felt suffocated by the HOA's authority. He began to add symbolic elements to his house. A large mural of a dove on one side, a phoenix rising from flames on the other. To him, it wasn't about winning anymore. It was about expression. Then came a knock on his door. When Ethan opened it, a city official stood outside holding a clipboard. Behind him, 2 police officers watched silently. They weren't there to arrest him, but they carried a notice. The HOA had filed a complaint with the city, claiming Ethan's house violated municipal aesthetic codes and caused traffic hazards from tourists stopping to take photos. It was another attack, a new front in the same war. But Ethan's smile didn't fade, because by now the cameras were rolling and the world was watching. The HOA had underestimated how powerful public opinion could be. As the sun set over Maple Lane, the Rainbow House glowed in the fading light, surrounded by quiet supporters and curious strangers. The battle had grown far beyond color. It was now a fight for the right to live freely, and the next move would decide everything. The sun rose quietly over Maple Lane, but the stillness didn't last long. By mid-morning, the once private neighborhood had become a revolving stage. Cars rolled by slowly, windows down, phones out. People wanted to see it. The now famous Rainbow House that defied the HOA. Ethan watched from his porch as a group of cyclists stopped to take selfies near his garden. A local news van was parked at the end of the cul-de-sac, waiting to film a segment. What had started as a local curiosity had now become a national story, a small act of rebellion that resonated with millions tired of arbitrary control. But for the HOA, the attention was nothing short of a disaster. Mrs. Caldwell sat in her office surrounded by newspapers and laptop screens showing endless social media coverage. Every headline seemed to mock her leadership. The HOA that hates color. Community cracks down on creativity. The Rainbow House versus the Beige Brigade. Her phone rang constantly. Some calls from angry residents demanding answers, others from journalists asking for interviews she refused to give. The board, once loyal and obedient, had begun to splinter. Several members privately questioned whether they should drop the case altogether, but Mrs. Caldwell refused to retreat. To her, this wasn't about paint anymore. It was about authority. She told herself that if she lost to one man, she'd lose control of everything she had built. The order, the quiet, the image of Maple Lane as a perfect suburban utopia. And so, she dug in deeper. New HOA notices began to appear on doors. New reminders about lawn length, mailbox height, and trash bin placement flooded residents' mailboxes. It was a show of power, a desperate attempt to remind everyone who was in charge. But it had the opposite effect. People were angry. For years, residents had accepted the HOA's constant interference because it seemed easier than fighting back. But now, seeing what Ethan endured, many realized just how much control they had surrendered. They began to talk, to share stories of unfair fines and intimidation. Some even formed small gatherings, quiet, frustrated neighbors comparing their experiences, united by resentment that had been brewing for years. Then, one night, someone painted a single rainbow stripe across the main neighborhood entrance sign. Just one bright, defiant line of color. No one claimed responsibility, but everyone knew what it meant. It was a message. The community was shifting. Soon, more changes appeared. Mailboxes began to sport small, colorful ribbons. Garden stones were painted in bright shades. Children drew chalk rainbows on the sidewalks. What had been a uniform neighborhood was slowly becoming alive with individuality. Mrs. Caldwell was furious. She called an emergency HOA meeting to restore order. The meeting hall was packed, more residents than ever before. Many were there out of anger, others simply to witness the confrontation that had been building for weeks. Mrs. Caldwell stood at the front, papers trembling in her hands as she tried to reassert control. She spoke of rules, structure, and tradition. She warned that without consistency, Maple Lane would fall into chaos. But as she lectured, the room's energy shifted. People were no longer afraid. One after another, residents began to speak. They talked about unnecessary fines, intimidation, and the constant feeling of being policed in their own homes. They talked about how Ethan's house had brought joy and attention to the neighborhood, not harm. They said children loved walking by it. Visitors smiled. Even local businesses had seen more customers because of the newfound traffic. Every word chipped away at Mrs. Caldwell's control. By the time the meeting ended, the board was divided. A few of her longtime allies quietly resigned, unwilling to face the growing backlash. The next morning, Mrs. Caldwell woke to find something she'd never imagined: a petition. It had been taped to the HOA's office door overnight. More than half the neighborhood had signed it, demanding new leadership and the dismissal of all fines and lawsuits against Ethan. The petition called for an emergency election. A complete reformation of the HOA. News of the rebellion spread quickly. Reporters returned, filming interviews with residents who had once been silent. They spoke openly about years of control and how Ethan's stand had given them courage. The HOA, once feared, was now ridiculed. The internet erupted again, this time with a new narrative. Not just about one man versus the HOA, but about an entire community reclaiming its freedom. Memes flooded social media. Images of beige houses turning rainbow one by one. Slogans like, "Be bold, not beige," trending across platforms. Ethan didn't start the movement intentionally, but he couldn't help feeling humbled by it. He watched the neighborhood transform, not just in color, but in spirit. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were now friends. Children who once played quietly now ran through the streets with chalk and paint, filling the sidewalks with color. But Mrs. Caldwell wasn't done yet. In her desperation, she took a step that shocked everyone. She contacted the city council directly, filing an appeal to enforce a local zoning rule that could override the court's earlier decision. She argued that Ethan's house was a public nuisance, attracting excessive attention and traffic, disrupting community peace. She believed that if the HOA couldn't silence him, the city could. The council agreed to review her claim, scheduling a hearing that would determine whether Ethan's home violated city aesthetic regulations. If the council ruled against him, he could be forced to repaint, regardless of the court case. When Ethan received notice of the hearing, he knew this was the final push. He also knew it wasn't just his battle anymore. Supporters rallied once more. Local artists volunteered to testify about the cultural value of his work. Neighbors prepared statements about how the house had brought positivity and community pride. Even strangers, People who had never met Ethan but had been inspired by his story, pledged to attend the hearing in solidarity. The day before the meeting, Maple Lane was busier than ever. Cars filled every corner, visitors walking up and down the street taking in the view. The Rainbow House shone brighter than ever under the afternoon sun, a living testament to creativity and courage. Mrs. Caldwell, however, watched from her window, bitterness hardening her expression. What was once her perfect neighborhood now looked, to her eyes, like chaos. That night, she sat at her desk surrounded by the last remnants of her authority. Stacks of fines, letters, and broken rules. Her reflection in the darkened window looked tired, older, but she refused to see defeat. For her, the next day was her last chance to reclaim order. For Ethan, it was the moment everything would change. The morning of the hearing arrived, draped in the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. The air was cool and heavy, and for the first time in weeks, Maple Lane was quiet. Even the birds seemed hesitant to break the silence. Ethan stood in front of his home, the rainbow colors glowing softly in the early light. The house looked peaceful, as if unaware that its very existence was about to be judged. Across the street, a few early risers watched from their porches, their expressions mixed: curiosity, nervousness, pride. For them, this wasn't just Ethan's fight anymore. It was theirs too. By mid-morning, the small city hall was overflowing. Reporters, residents, and supporters crowded into the chambers, the murmur of voices echoing off the walls. Cameras flashed as Ethan walked in, his lawyer beside him. Behind him, dozens of Maple Lane neighbors followed, holding handmade signs that read things like, "Let art live," and "Our neighborhood, our choice." At the front of the room sat the 5 members of the city council, tired, formal, and already aware that today's hearing had drawn more attention than any zoning issue in years. Then came Mrs. Caldwell. She entered with her lawyer and a small entourage of remaining loyalists from the HOA. Her face was tight, every step deliberate. She avoided eye contact with the crowd, focusing instead on the row of council members who would soon decide her fate, and Ethan's. The hearing began with a formal statement from the chairperson. The issue on the docket: whether Ethan Wells' home, known publicly as the Rainbow House, violated local aesthetic or zoning regulations, and whether it constituted a public nuisance due to increased visitor traffic. Mrs. Caldwell's attorney spoke first. His voice was steady but sharp, each word chosen to sound reasonable while carrying accusation. He argued that Ethan's house had disrupted the peace of the community, that it attracted constant traffic and noise, and that its unapproved, non-conforming color scheme violated the character of the neighborhood. He cited safety hazards from parked cars, property value fluctuations, and psychological distress among longtime residents. Every few sentences, Mrs. Caldwell nodded firmly, her lips pressed thin in satisfaction. But as the lawyer continued, the audience began to stir. Whispers spread, quiet scoffs of disbelief, and the occasional shake of a head. The narrative he painted, of chaos and suffering, was far from the reality most residents had experienced. When he finally finished, the council thanked him and called Ethan's side to speak. Ethan's lawyer rose first. Calm, composed, and articulate, she began by addressing the root of the conflict. Not a zoning issue, but a power struggle. She explained that no city ordinance prohibited the use of bright or multiple colors on private homes. She presented photographs showing that Ethan's property was well maintained, safe, and clean. Then she paused and gestured for Ethan to step forward. Ethan approached the microphone. For a moment he simply looked around the room, at his neighbors, the reporters, the cameras. He wasn't a politician or a speaker. He was just a man who wanted to paint his house. But that simplicity made his words all the more powerful. He spoke about creativity, about how his home had become something more than color. It had become connection. He described how strangers had stopped to talk, how neighbors had grown closer, how children laughed and played where silence once ruled. He told them he hadn't built a nuisance. He'd built joy. There was no anger in his voice, only calm conviction. When he finished, the room was silent. Then, slowly, applause began to ripple through the audience. Hesitant at first, then growing. The council chair had to tap his gavel to restore order. Next came the public comments. One by one, residents stepped up to speak. Some had lived in Maple Lane for decades, others were newer, but their message was consistent. The Rainbow House had brought pride, not shame. It had made people smile, reminded them that individuality wasn't a crime. A few mentioned how oppressive the HOA had become, how they had lived in fear of minor infractions and constant fines. They said Ethan's courage had reminded them what community really meant. Even those who admitted they didn't love the bright colors still defended his right to have them. Then, unexpectedly, an older woman from the far back of the room stood up. She was quiet, unassuming, and spoke softly into the microphone. She revealed she had lived next door to Ethan since the day he moved in, and that despite initial shock at his project, she had come to love it. She described how every morning the light hit his house in a way that brightened her mood. "It makes me happy," she said simply. "Isn't that what a home should do?" That line landed like a stone in water, rippling through everyone present. Even the council members shifted in their seats. Mrs. Caldwell's turn came next, and for the first time her voice trembled. She defended her actions, insisting it was never personal, that rules were rules, and that if they allowed one exception, the entire system would fall apart. But her words fell flat. The crowd had already made up its mind. After hours of statements, evidence, and testimony, the council adjourned briefly to deliberate. The audience waited in tense silence. When they returned, the decision was swift. The council ruled unanimously in Ethan's favor. His home, they declared, did not violate any city code or regulation. There were no laws against color, no proof of nuisance, and no legitimate grounds for the HOA's actions. The ruling also recommended that the HOA cease all enforcement efforts related to paint color, citing harassment and abuse of authority. The room erupted in cheers. Reporters rushed to capture the moment as Ethan stood frozen in disbelief. Mrs. Caldwell sat still, her expression blank, as if her entire world had just collapsed in front of her. For the first time, she had lost, publicly, undeniably, and completely. Outside, cameras flashed as people celebrated. Neighbors hugged, strangers congratulated Ethan, and local artists offered to donate pieces to his home as a show of solidarity. The internet exploded again, this time under a new headline. "The Rainbow House wins. HOA defeated in landmark hearing." That evening, Maple Lane came alive. Families gathered outside, children drew chalk rainbows along the pavement, and someone brought a speaker playing soft music. It wasn't planned, but it felt like a festival, spontaneous, joyous, and freeing. Ethan stood on his porch, looking at the sunset reflecting off the painted walls. For the first time in months, he felt peace. The battle was over, or so he thought, because while the world celebrated his victory, one woman sat alone in her dimly lit office, surrounded by stacks of papers and the crumbling remains of her authority. Mrs. Caldwell's face was hard, unreadable, and on her desk, half buried beneath a pile of legal forms, lay a single letter, a resignation notice she couldn't bring herself to sign. Yet even in defeat, her pride burned too fiercely to let go completely, and she wasn't done yet. The weeks following the hearing transformed Maple Lane in ways no one could have imagined. What had once been a quiet, uniform neighborhood was now a local landmark. Cars rolled by slowly, windows down, as families pointed and took photos. Tourists came from nearby towns to see the Rainbow House, sometimes bringing small gifts, flowers, drawings, or thank you notes. Ethan's home had become more than just a house. It was a symbol of defiance, creativity, and quiet rebellion against control. And though the HOA's power had officially been curbed, the ripple effects of the victory were only beginning. Neighbors who once whispered in fear of the HOA now stood tall. Some repainted their doors bright shades of blue and yellow. Others planted colorful flower beds, no longer afraid of being fined. Maple Lane was changing. not just in color, but in spirit, yet not everyone shared the joy. Inside her home, just a few streets away, Mrs. Caldwell sat in silence most days. The once proud leader of the HOA found herself isolated. The board had fractured, members resigning one by one after the public humiliation. Her inbox, once full of community updates, was now flooded with angry messages, cancellation notices, and resignation letters. But pride, that relentless ember inside her, refused to die out. She convinced herself she wasn't wrong, just misunderstood. The world, she thought, had turned against order and discipline. Ethan had turned her neighborhood into a circus. Her bitterness grew with each passing day. And with that bitterness came an idea. One final attempt to regain control. Late one night, she gathered every piece of documentation she had. HOA bylaws, city ordinances, tax records, property assessments. Her goal was simple: to find something, anything, that could still be used against him. She believed that if she could not destroy the paint, she could destroy the man behind it. For days she worked in secret. Meanwhile, Ethan's life had blossomed. Local newspapers featured his story. A small art collective reached out, offering to fund a community mural inspired by his home. Even a regional TV station filmed a short segment titled "The House That Broke the HOA." He never expected fame. In truth, he just wanted peace. But with recognition came noise, and he started to notice the subtle shadows that came with it. A car parked across the street too long. A letter slipped under his door with no return address. Petty vandalism. Paint eggs thrown at the driveway one night. His mailbox knocked over another. It wasn't the random cruelty of strangers. It felt deliberate. Ethan didn't want to believe Mrs. Caldwell would stoop so low, but in his heart, he knew she hadn't truly accepted her loss. Then one morning, it happened. He received a certified letter from the city. Inside was a notice, a formal complaint filed against his property for unauthorized commercial use. According to the report, his home was allegedly being used as a business due to the high volume of visitors and photography taking place. If proven true, he could face steep fines and even forced removal of his exterior design. At first, Ethan's heart sank. It was the same tactic, just under a new disguise. The HOA couldn't control him anymore, but Mrs. Caldwell had found a back door through bureaucracy. However, what she hadn't expected was how much had changed. This time, Ethan wasn't alone. Within hours of the notice being posted, his neighbors mobilized. Dozens wrote letters to the city defending him, explaining that the visits were voluntary, casual, and part of a community revitalization, not a business. Online supporters flooded the city's social media pages, demanding the complaint be dropped. The story reignited online under a new viral title: HOA Karen's Last Attempt to Take Down the Rainbow House. Public opinion swung hard. News crews returned. Talk shows picked up the story again. And as scrutiny turned toward the complainant, Mrs. Caldwell found herself once more in the center of unwanted attention. The city eventually investigated the claim and found it baseless. There were no violations, no sales, no profit. Just a man who painted his home. The case was dismissed in less than a week. When the notice of dismissal arrived, Ethan didn't gloat. He simply folded the paper, placed it in a drawer, and walked outside. That evening, the neighborhood gathered once more. Without planning it, they held a small block party. Children drew chalk rainbows on the road again, music played, and laughter filled the air. Ethan looked around and realized that even the homes that remained plain now had small bursts of color. A bright red door here, a pastel blue mailbox there. His fight had started as personal, but it had become something much larger. He stood on his porch, gazing at the horizon. The rainbow-painted walls around him glowed in the golden light of sunset, a kaleidoscope of peace. He felt something he hadn't in a long time: freedom. Across town, in a quiet house stripped of authority and pride, Mrs. Caldwell finally signed her resignation letter. Her hand trembled slightly as she set the pen down. For years she had lived for control, believing order was the same as happiness. But as she looked out her window at the fading sky, she realized she had been wrong. The HOA she once ruled was now disbanded. Her power was gone. Her name had become a cautionary tale, and the man she tried to silence had turned her downfall into art. She closed her blinds, the faint echo of neighborhood laughter drifting through the night. On Maple Lane, the party continued late into the evening. For the first time in years, people felt united, not by fear, but by freedom. And as the moon rose high, casting a silver glow across the bright spectrum of Ethan's home, the story of the Rainbow House found its quiet conclusion, not as an act of rebellion, not as an act of vengeance, but as proof that sometimes the most powerful kind of revenge isn't destruction, it's creation.